"Is that a janitor?" The words were whispered, but they cracked the silence in the boardroom like thunder. 12 executives in tailored suits stared in disbelief as Margaret Langford, owner of Langford Holdings, entered the room in her signature crimson heels accompanied by a man in a faded blue jumpsuit, still clutching a gray cleaning rag in one hand. Not a briefcase, not a portfolio. A rag. He stood there awkwardly, eyes low, like a man who'd taken a wrong turn and stumbled into a world that wasn't his. Except he hadn't. Margaret looked at the board members. All of them white-collar strategists who thought they'd seen everything, and said 5 words that made one of them choke on his coffee. "He's here on my request." They didn't know his name. Not yet. But by the end of that meeting, they'd never forget it. "Thank you for being here." Sometimes, the smallest moments carry the greatest meaning. Today's story is one of those. Quiet, powerful, and worth remembering. If it touches your heart, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like more stories like this, you're warmly invited to subscribe and tap the bell so you won't miss the next one. Now let's take a closer look at what really happened. The elevator doors slid open with a quiet hiss. The marble floor reflected the morning light like glass. Executives straightened in their seats. A few adjusted their ties. One muttered something under his breath about being ready to pounce. This was supposed to be a decisive meeting. Numbers, assets, strategy. But then came the sound no one expected, click at heels. Red ones. And beside them a pair of worn, rubber-soled work shoes. The contrast was almost theatrical. Margaret Langford, widowed matriarch of Langford Holdings and owner of a billion-dollar empire, strode into the boardroom with the grace of someone born into power. But everyone's eyes were fixed on the man walking beside her. A man with no name tag, no tailored suit, no reason to be there at all, but at least from their perspective. He looked out of place, unshaven, nervous, holding a cleaning rag like it might protect him from what came next. Peter Morales, the janitor. The silence was painful. You could hear the antique clock ticking on the wall. Executives exchanged puzzled glances. Margaret's assistant Lawrence cleared his throat. "Mrs. Langford, I." She raised a hand without looking at him. "I invited him." Peter flinched. He wasn't used to being looked at, let alone introduced. Not in a room like this, and now all eyes were on him. Margaret moved to the head of the table slowly, deliberately. Then sat. She smiled. Not kindly, not coldly, just with the ease of someone in control. "I know what you're thinking," she said, her voice even. "And I don't care." A chair shifted. Pens clicked. Some arms folded across expensive suits. Everyone was waiting for an explanation. Peter wanted to melt into the carpet. The rag in his hand felt like a weight. He couldn't bring himself to speak, and Margaret didn't push him. She laced her fingers together and looked around the room. "A few weeks ago," she began, "I was walking through the 6th floor. That made a few heads turn. The 6th floor was for support staff. Custodial, mailroom, maintenance. Margaret Langford didn't go to the 6th floor. On my way to a meeting," she continued, "I passed the break room. And I heard something strange." Some leaned in. Others squinted, suspicious. "It wasn't small talk," she said. "Wasn't gossip. It was a conversation about market trends, financial modeling, asset repositioning." People blinked. Peter lowered his gaze. I stopped. I listened. And I realized someone was explaining complex investment strategies. Without a spreadsheet, without a screen, just pure analysis. And they were making more sense than half the advisors I've paid 6 figures to. A ripple of discomfort moved through the room. "I looked inside," she said softly, "and saw Peter." There was a long pause, talking to another janitor about post-recession recovery strategies. One of the executives chuckled awkwardly. Another checked his watch. But Margaret wasn't finished. I stood there for 15 minutes listening. He wasn't quoting books. He wasn't flexing jargon. He was explaining the logic behind the 2008 crash like someone who had lived it, not just studied it. Peter hadn't said a word yet. His mouth was dry. Margaret turned to him. "Tell them what your father did." Peter hesitated, then spoke barely above a whisper. "He owned a business," he said. "Small, nothing fancy. Taught me everything about money, real money, how it moves, what it means. She nodded. And what happened? He died, Peter said. Cancer. I dropped out of school to work. I couldn't afford tuition. I started cleaning buildings. I never stopped learning. Just stopped being seen. The words hung in the air. Nobody interrupted. Margaret glanced around the room again. I asked him to come today, to listen, and if needed, to speak. A sharp intake of breath from Martin Caldwell, the head of corporate strategy. Mrs. Langford, he said with forced amusement. I'm sure this is meant to make a point, but today's agenda is full of critical, sensitive material. Margaret smiled again, but it wasn't the kind of smile that meant compromise. Exactly, she said, and that's why he's here. She nodded toward Peter. He sees what you don't. A few executives bristled. Alyssa Chen, a junior analyst, glanced down at her tablet, unsure what to think. Lawrence Stanton, the CFO, leaned forward. With respect, he said carefully, today's discussion is about underperforming divisions and projected losses. There are legal implications. Peter shifted. Margaret turned slightly. Tell them what you told me, she said. Peter looked at her, then at the room. He knew the numbers. He'd read the internal memos left on copy machines, the performance reports that executives forgot in break rooms. He saw what they didn't because no one thought he was watching. And maybe that's what gave him an edge, because while they were too important to notice him, he noticed everything. He cleared his throat. You're bleeding cash in logistics, he said. A few brows furrowed. Peter's voice got stronger. You're outsourcing freight at inflated rates, while your internal fleet runs below 50% capacity. Lawrence blinked. Peter went on. You're using fuel models from 2019. Your contracts are locked at rates that don't match current fuel surcharges. You're sitting on trucks, staff, and warehouse space, and still paying premium for external services. A silence. Peter placed a simple chart on the table, handwritten. No PowerPoint, no buzzwords, just numbers that told the truth. Alyssa was scrolling fast on her tablet now. He's right, she murmured. Lawrence looked stunned. Peter leaned in, steady now. If you reassign 30% of those shipments to your in-house fleet, you cut $8 million annually. Maybe more. Margaret said nothing. She didn't need to. The room had already changed. 5 minutes ago, Peter was a janitor. Now he was the smartest man in the room. And for the first time, they knew it. Peter Morales looked around the room. The boardroom that once seemed impossibly far away now felt silent. No coughing, no page turning, no fake smiles. Just tension, like a storm waiting for thunder. Thunder, the kind of silence that happens when a room full of people realizes they might have underestimated the wrong man. Martin Caldwell leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, jaw tight. So, he said slowly, we're supposed to believe that a janitor solved a logistics crisis our entire analytics team missed for 2 quarters. He didn't laugh. He didn't need to. The sarcasm did all the heavy lifting. Peter opened his mouth, then closed it again. Margaret Langford didn't flinch. She looked at Martin and said just one word. Yes. Lawrence Stanton, still trying to regain control, cleared his throat. We've had consultants. Experienced ones. This company isn't built on gut feelings. Peter didn't react. But he wanted to. He wanted to shout that he wasn't guessing, he had studied. For years, during overnight shifts, in break rooms, sitting in the supply closet with an old iPhone and a cracked screen, analyzing charts while scrubbing grout. But instead he's simply setting, I don't expect you to believe me. He paused. But I'll show you. He placed a thin folder on the table. Inside were handwritten notes, diagrams, freight cost comparisons, historical rate averages. Every page was proof. Martin scoffed. This is amateur. Margaret didn't blink. Amateurs don't save companies $8 million before lunch, she said. A flicker of unease crossed Martin's face. But it wasn't just him. The room had split. Some execs sat stiff-backed, arms crossed, faces unreadable. Others leaned forward, quietly intrigued. Alyssa Chen was one of them. She didn't speak, but she kept scrolling, double-checking, verifying. It all checked out. Tell me this, she finally said, looking up. How did you even get these numbers? Peter met her eyes. I paid attention. He wasn't being clever. It was the truth. While executives argued in PowerPoint and missed memos, Peter had been listening, watching, invisible. Until now. Lawrence leaned forward, elbows on the glass table. So, say we do it your way. What happens next? You restructure, Peter replied. Not with cuts, with clarity. He pointed to the internal fleet metrics. Your trucks run half full. You're paying contractors to do what your team is trained to do. Your logistics chief is 3 years behind on optimization protocols. He's coasting, and nobody's watching. Lawrence winced. He was watching now. Peter didn't stop. You're burning shareholder trust, because on paper, it looks like you're busy. But in reality, you're just noisy. A long pause. Alyssa leaned back, letting out a quiet breath. He's right. Peter looked around the table. I'm not here to embarrass anyone, he said, but the truth is this company stopped listening a long time ago. Margaret tilted her head, intrigued. Peter continued, I've cleaned the floors of this building for 4 years. I've walked past strategy meetings, heard excuses louder than results, and I never said a word because I wasn't supposed to. Martin crossed his arms. Because you're not qualified, he said sharply. Peter turned. I'm not paper qualified. That's true. But I've spent more hours learning this company's operations than most of you have reading your own reports. The insult landed. Martin stood up. This is absurd. He doesn't belong here. This is a boardroom, not a charity. Margaret slowly rose from her chair. Every movement was calculated, precise. Martin, she said, I invited Peter here because he understands something most people in this room have forgotten. How to see what matters. Martin didn't sit. So what now? You make him a consultant. Margaret nodded once. I already did. The gasp was almost collective. Martin slammed a hand on the table. This is reckless. Margaret leaned toward him slightly. No, Martin. What's reckless is letting pride blind us from progress. The room was boiling. Martin turned to Lawrence, desperate. Back me up here. Lawrence's voice was quieter now. I want to hear more. Martin stared. You can't be serious. Lawrence met his gaze. I'm tired of the same conversations. Maybe it's time we listen to someone new. That silenced Martin. Peter finally exhaled. His hands trembled just a little, but he wasn't scared anymore. For the first time in years, the voice inside his head wasn't whispering, You don't belong. It was saying, Now they see you. Margaret sat back down. She looked at Peter, her expression unreadable. Can you build a new logistics model? Peter nodded. I already started. The moment snapped into focus. A janitor, now a consultant, was leading the conversation, not out of pity. Not because someone handed it to him, because he earned it. The room that had once watched him like a mistake was now listening to him like a solution. And that was just the beginning. The next morning, Peter Morales stood of the full-length mirror in his tiny apartment, tugging awkwardly at the sleeves of a navy blazer. It wasn't custom-made, wasn't expensive, but it was new. Folded neatly across the bed was his old blue jumpsuit, the one that still smelled faintly of bleach and industrial floor wax. He looked at it for a moment, then at himself. He didn't feel different, just heavier. There's a kind of weight that comes with being seen, not the weight of responsibility, the weight of expectation, and that was waiting for him. When Peter stepped out of the elevator on the 34th floor of Langford Holdings, he was no longer invisible. He felt it immediately. Eyes tracking him down the corridor, whispers behind polished glass walls, a young assistant pretending not to stare. He walked past the place he used to clean every night. Now he was walking toward it. Alyssa Chen was waiting outside the conference room with a stack of folders. You ready? She asked, handing him a report. Peter nodded. No one's going easy on you, she added. He gave a small smile. I wouldn't want them to. Inside, the room was already filling up. Executives, analysts, department heads. And Martin Caldwell, arms crossed, jaw tight, seated at the far end like a judge in a trial no one asked for. Lawrence Stanton, the CFO, stood near the whiteboard. Let's begin, he said, nodding to Peter. Just like that. The table turned to him. Peter spread out his model on the screen. 3 slides, no animation, no design fluff. Just facts, hard numbers. operational patterns, truck routes, unit costs, and a three-phase restructuring plan that cut $8 million in waste, without layoffs. For the first 10 minutes, no one spoke. Then came the questions. A wave of them. What about the fuel surcharge adjustment windows? How will fleet drivers respond to expanded regional routes? How does this affect insurance? Peter had answers, not perfect ones, but real ones. He knew the risks, the limits, the choke points in their own system. He'd mapped them at 2 a.m., leaning over spreadsheets at his kitchen table. But the harder part wasn't defending his math. It was surviving the room, every look, every whispered doubt. He felt them like pinpricks, because even as he answered, a part of him still thought, they're waiting for me to mess up. At the end of the meeting, Margaret stepped into the room. She hadn't said a word, but she had listened. All of it. When Peter turned to leave, she motioned for him to follow. They stepped into her office. Floor-to-ceiling glass framing the skyline like a painting. She turned her back to him and looked out. Well, she asked. Peter hesitated. I think I convinced them. Margaret turned. Her eyes were calm. He didn't need to. He blinked. What do you mean? She stepped closer. I didn't ask you here to impress them. I asked you here to replace them. The words hit like thunder. Peter swallowed. That's not what I know, she said gently. But that's what this is. She stepped to her desk, picked up a thick folder. Lawrence is retiring. Martin doesn't know it yet, but he's been benched. She handed him the folder. Start interviewing for your own team. He stared at it like it was radioactive. Ike, I'm not ready for this. Margaret sat down, folded her hands. Peter, do you know why I picked you? He said nothing. She didn't wait. In the Southeast, because you listened when no one else did. You saw what no one else bothered to look at. You didn't just understand the numbers. You understood what they meant. He felt something twist inside him. An old voice. I never even got a degree. Margaret's smile didn't falter. Half the people running hedge funds didn't either. A pause. I don't care about degrees. I care about truth. And you've been carrying it on your back for years. Peter looked down at his hands. They were trembling again. Not because he was afraid. Because he finally believed her. But belief doesn't protect you from the pressure. That night, Peter couldn't sleep. He paced his apartment, read and reread the logistics file, redrafted slides. He thought about his father, how they used to eat dinner on plastic plates and talk about balance sheets like other families talked about baseball. He thought about how his life had narrowed so slowly he didn't even notice. Until someone opened a door and said, "Go!" Now he was through the door, and there was no turning back. At 6:03 a.m. the next morning, Peter walked into the boardroom early. He placed his binder on the table, took a deep breath, and waited. The room filled up. No red carpet, no applause, just stares, then questions, tougher this time. What if the supplier partnership pushback hits? Have you modeled how restructuring affects third-party contracts? Where's your legal impact analysis? Peter stood his ground. I don't have every answer, but I have a direction. That honesty disarmed them more than confidence ever could. Lawrence leaned forward. You're saying we stop outsourcing altogether. Peter shook his head. I'm saying we stop doing it blindly. That landed. Even Martin, arms still crossed, was listening now, not because he wanted to, because he had to, because the room had changed, because Peter had changed. The meeting ended. Executives filed out slowly, like people stepping into new weather. Peter stayed behind, looking out the window. Alyssa walked up beside him. You know what they're calling you? He turned. What? She smiled faintly. The janitor who flipped the table. He laughed. Quietly, and then she handed him a manila envelope. What's this? Your official title. He opened it and froze. Director of Operational Strategy. She winked. Looks like you're sitting at the table now. He held the paper like it might disappear. He didn't cry. But something inside him finally loosened. And for the first time in years, Peter Morales allowed himself to breathe. 2 weeks later, a story began to circulate. Not in newspapers, not on financial blogs, but in quiet places whispered between interns, assistants, and security guards. They said a janitor walked into a boardroom and left a dozen executives speechless. They said he fixed $1 million problem before anyone knew his name. They said Margaret Langford offered him a job on the spot. Some called it a myth. Others knew better. On a rainy Thursday morning, Peter Morales rode the elevator alone. No mop, no supply cart, just a binder in his left hand and a black pen tucked behind his ear. He still wasn't used to the quiet that came with being seen. He missed being ignored sometimes. It was simpler. But then the doors opened, and waiting outside was Alyssa holding 2 coffees. "Black, no sugar," she said. He smiled. "You remembered." "I pay attention," she said. They both laughed softly. The kind of laugh people share when they've survived something together. Inside the boardroom, Martin Caldwell was no longer seated at the table. His office had been cleared out 3 days ago. No memo, no meeting. Just silence. Some said he resigned. Others said Margaret let him go. Peter never asked. He didn't need to. He had work to do. Later that afternoon, he stepped into Margaret's office for his weekly check-in. She was sitting by the window, her shoes kicked off, sipping tea. "You look like someone who hasn't slept," she said, not looking up. Peter chuckled. "I haven't." She finally turned. "You're learning." He sat across from her. "I thought this would get easier." "It won't," she said simply. "But that's why you belong here." Peter exhaled. "You could pick anyone. Why me?" Margaret studied him for a long moment. Then she said, "Because you reminded me of my husband." And Peter blinked. He built this company with nothing but a ledger book and a folding chair. He used to say, "The smartest person in the room is the one asking the quietest question." She smiled softly. "You asked all the right ones." Even when no one listened. Peter looked down. "I still feel like I don't belong." As she leaned forward. "Then you're already better than most of them." That night, Peter walked home in the rain. No umbrella, no rush, just the sound of his shoes against the pavement and the hum of the city around him. At a stoplight, he saw a man in a blue jumpsuit pushing a cleaning cart into a late-night office. Peter stopped. He nodded. The man didn't smile, just nodded back. Tired, wet, invisible. Peter watched him for a moment, then turned and kept walking. But something in his chest ached, because he knew what it meant to stand behind that cart and carry more than anyone realized. Miat 2-17 Peter sat at his kitchen table, same table where he used to read economic case studies next to an empty coffee pot and a space where his father used to sit. The apartment hadn't changed. But he had, and as he scribbled notes for the next day's proposal, he stopped, put down his pen, and whispered, "I hope you're watching." You're watching, because maybe his father never got to sit in that boardroom, but Peter did, and that meant something. Some stories don't end with applause. They end with someone showing up early, paying attention, doing the work. Even when no one is looking, especially when no one is looking. Peter Morales wasn't a prodigy. He wasn't lucky. He was ready. Long before anyone gave him permission to be, and sometimes that's all it takes. The final narration call to heartening life doesn't always hand you a seat at the table. Sometimes you have to build it from scraps. Sometimes you scrub the floor for years. Before anyone even notices, you know how to read the blueprints. But greatness doesn't wear a uniform, and potential doesn't need permission. So if you've ever been overlooked, dismissed, told you didn't belong, remember this story. And remember Peter, he didn't wait to be invited. He just paid attention. And when the moment came, he was ready. If this story moved you, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated? Or quietly carried knowledge the world didn't see? We'd love to hear your story. And if you'd like more powerful, human stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss what's coming next. Thank you for spending this time with us. Until next time, keep paying attention. We live in a world obsessed with tightless degrees and doors that only open with the right key. But sometimes, the most valuable voices don't come from corner offices or Ivy League resumes. Sometimes, they come from the quiet man with calloused hands, the one who's been watching, learning, Waiting. The truth is this: you don't need permission to be brilliant. You don't need a suit to have vision. And you don't need a title to lead. What you do need is patience, discipline, and a belief in yourself that doesn't depend on who's watching. Because the world may overlook you for years, but one day it won't. So keep preparing, keep learning, and when that moment comes, step into it fully, because you belong. If this story touched your heart, even just a little, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been overlooked? Have you ever proven someone wrong just by being true to who you are? Tell us in the comments. Your voice matters here. And if you want more stories like this, quiet, powerful, and unforgettable, please consider subscribing and tapping the bell. It costs nothing, but it means everything. We share stories that honor the unseen, the underestimated, and the everyday heroes who never stopped believing. Thank you for spending time with us today. Until next time, take care of yourself and don't forget to pay attention.